Okay, here we go. We're all set. Sorry for the delay. I guess you kind of enjoyed it, so that's good. All right, so today we're going to talk about wastewater stabilization lagoons. It kind of connects pretty well with that concept of a artificial wetland, essentially mimicking what happens in nature in terms of how biological organic matter stuff is degraded anyway. You know, if you're out in nature, you'll see a lot of stuff that we might call wastewater if we had collected all that and discharged it somewhere, right? But, animals, plants, decaying matter, all sorts of stuff can contribute biological oxygen demand and other things. So, swampy territories, it feels kind of like, oh, some of these parameters we would normally regulate, but this is just naturally occurring, right? So some of that kind of stuff is like, how does nature deal with it? How does it get processed in natural systems? We're going to imitate that with the artificial wetlands. And another possibility is to use the fancy word is lagoon, but really a pond, some sort of pond that's designed specifically for that. So that's kind of what we're going to cover today. I already said next week will be one session on written communication, and then no lecture. When we return after that, primarily what we'll be working on is either kind of special topics research. If you have something interesting you wanted to hear about, learn about, I could probably prepare a lecture for that. And then your presentations to teach each other about the projects. We'll have a little time, certainly between your senior design and that. But that's sort of the rest of the class will look that way. Maybe I'll find a way to have another kind of debate, discussion type of thing at some point as well. Okay, so today then is sort of our last of the set of specified lectures, topical lectures that I wanted to cover. Okay, so wastewater stabilization lagoons. Got some pros and cons up front. One of the obvious benefits would be it's pretty simple to say, hey, let's make a pond, pour water in it, let water drain at the other side. That's pretty easy to do, technically speaking. It's not going to require a lot of energy. Perhaps if you're doing some aeration, that might take a bit, but even then you're still probably just making a fountain and making sure it's running, right? So that would be simple enough to get the water mixing with the air to get good aeration. So your operational costs are pretty low. You really don't need any full-time staff to operate one. Somebody to check on it, somebody that knows how to maintenance any of the technical pieces is important, but you don't need somebody there full-time by any means. It's great for cases where you're tropical or subtropical, where you have a lot of sunlight. That's another big source of oxygen for your typical lagoon system, which means that's from algae, photosynthesis, that's providing the capacity to remove that biological oxygen demand. This is another a good possibility if you have areas with lots of clay soil. Instead of using some sort of absorption field, maybe you just get a lagoon system going, design it, and use that as your wastewater treatment. So some of the downsides then would be it's a pretty large land area. So if land is not cheap, this is probably not a good option, right? So that can definitely be a constraint. You really have to either line it or use clay. So if you have that clay lining, because you don't want your wastewater seeping into the ground, presumably. Maybe in certain situations that it's possibly acceptable, but generally we wouldn't want to do that to avoid that contamination. If you get a lot of rainfall, where's that going, right? That's another problem. So if your region has a dry season and a wet season, is the wet season just going to overflow all this? That's not going to be so good, right? You don't want your undertreated or non-treated wastewater just flowing straight out into the nearest water body, right, or wherever else. It's a lot of risk for human contact there. It's not a great option for cold climates. These lagoons don't work super well when they freeze over. Bacteria don't like to grow too much. It's still possible to an extent, but you have to add some extra capacity, some plan for how much is going to just be stored there, and plan for the time when it starts being released, and how can you make sure that's going to be sufficiently treated, and all of that. Just all of those considerations, it's just not so ideal, even if possible. Microbe populations are a potential risk here in terms of if they're shocked by, let's say, heavy rainfall, maybe it doesn't flood everything out, but it disrupts the pH or something. You could have a situation where your microbes that were doing their business properly and in a pretty stable manner, and suddenly you get some weird microbes growing, or a bunch die off, and then you're not getting the treatment you're expecting, and it would disrupt your outcomes, your effluent outcomes there. And of course, odor, right? When these are operating properly, it probably just smells a little swampy, maybe a little earthy. Most wastewater treatment systems, if they're operating well, don't smell terribly. It's if you have anaerobic processes generating the smelly stuff without any capture or prevention or anything. So we'll talk a little bit about why a lagoon system, when going well, can do okay on that. But certainly that's something that could become an issue if there's just the wrong wind conditions or things like that. Okay, so we've got a little image. I talked a little bit about this in terms of the wetlands last time, but here's that plant in Mandeville is using a series of lagoons, and so we'll take a look at that and some other highlights as well. Okay, so we have a couple different types of wastewater treatment lagoons, and by the way, these ponds, lagoons, whatever you want to call them, it's kind of funny with the way we regulate water bodies in the U.S. We had to specifically carve out, we're regulating water bodies, and so you make a pond and then put wastewater in it, and suddenly that's a water body. If we're, so in the definitions for our EPA guidance, we say except for these lagoons, right? So it kind of begs the question, if you were to have a pond on your own property and whatever, like certain discharges would be illegal, but is that pond itself, is that allowed to be in violation of standards? Some interesting questions there about private property and all that. But at any rate, so we have a few types of ponds. We have an anaerobic pond. This would be a deeper pond where we intentionally allow the depths of it to become anoxic. So we're going to have, that'll be kind of like a septic system where we're having that type of digestion, anaerobic processes going. These would be typical with high organic loading, and then you expect something like 80% BOD removal. Usually you'd want to treat that more, at least to finish off the BOD removal and probably re-up the oxygen, because if you're discharging something anaerobic, that's not so good. And these I would expect generally would have more of the odor issues if the whole pond is anaerobic. Then we'll have what we call a facultative pond. I think this is the more common variety. These are going to be a mixture of anaerobic and aerobic. So you'll have a kind of a moderate depth, something about like 8 feet deep, where the lower lying area is deep enough where it's not getting sunshine, it's not getting algae growth, oxygen production at depth, and it's deep enough where it's not mixing super well with the surface, which with a little bit of wind or anything will have some pretty good oxygen exchange. So if you have it a bit deep, then you have a zone that's going to be anaerobic, and then a zone that's going to be aerobic. Unless you cover the anaerobic ponds, you're probably going to have some amount that's anaerobic that's aerobic on top as well, or maybe you just cover it to avoid that. But these facultative ponds, that's kind of the way they're designed, and then there's some mixing of your organics and things just by diffusion through these layers, and overall you have a combination of the aerobic treatment and anaerobic treatment, and you end up with a pretty good BOD removal and processing of your waste there. And then you can have simply fully aerated lagoons, right? And if we take a look at this one again, all of these aerators, these fountains, spraying water up, those are going to be providing an aerated pond. So I would expect that this middle one is approximately fully aerated. In terms of, like, that would be an aerated pond. So that oxygen supplied, typically some sort of mechanical device. In this case, so some sort of fountain. Sometimes you'll have like a paddle wheel that's just pushing the water along through a pond, like a raceway pond or something, but it's also kicking water up into the air and just mixing it generally. So there's some mix there, some possibilities. You might have, as in this case, you might have some zones where you don't have the aeration, and you're going to have some anaerobic and you're going to have some aerobic spots, right? But this could be like one aerated lagoon can be a part of a larger system like that. Okay, so typical setup might look something like this, where you have your wastewater collection system coming in, some pretreatment, bar, screen rack, maybe primary sedimentation. Probably not always necessary, but because that'll kind of just happen in the ponds. But send your wastewater into your system, maybe distribute it through a couple of facultative ponds like this, and then from here we see all of this is being collected and then sent through this. What you'll notice if you stop and think about it a moment and recall kind of reactor design, these first two look approximately like a CSTR. Probably not quite if they're a bit long, but pretty close. Or maybe they could be modeled by a couple of CSTRs, right? Because these are presumably fairly well mixed. They're facultative, meaning we have aeration happening. So maybe you can divide it in half and say, okay, there's a couple, it's approximately two CSTRs here. Model it that way, and that tells you something about how it's functioning. And then down here, we see they have it more channelized, so this is acting more like a plug flow reactor. And here you could section part of it off and say, okay, I'm going to let it go anaerobic for this portion while it's in this area, and then re-aerate again before the end. Things like that type of design are common. Of course, that'll be up to the designers to say specifically how are they meeting their treatment goals and all that. But those are the types of options you'll see in play. Okay, here's another example I found. I don't know if I took this online. I'm forgetting where exactly this is. But you see a nice example of a pond system here where we have a couple of lagoons. You can see a bunch of algae growing on this one. And essentially a larger pond here. And you can kind of see how they could design this to have a flow through the system into different regions, different segments based on what they wanted to do with it. So even just having this little peninsula baffle type thing, just letting the water flow around in some particular direction, right? So there's a lot you can do. You can sequence it, you can segment it, a bunch of things like that. There's actually one in Nicaragua. So this is a map of Chinandega where we were. Now, and maybe I should go over to Google Maps to show you a little closer, but we didn't travel over here directly. I've visited this just near the lagoon here before. So this is the wastewater lagoon system. I think it's two ponds here where we have kind of a bunch of algae growing in this area, I think. So and I'm not sure exactly, they might have, they might aerate here or something. I don't know how they're operating, but then their discharge, I do know, cuts something like right into here, and there's the river there. We passed over that on the road several times, kind of downtown Chinandega. This river is flowing this way, and I know the wastewater cuts straight through, probably discharges right about here, straight through this area, which is just a landfill. and it's pretty awful conditions there. And if we were to zoom in right here, it would look kind of interesting. This is a cemetery, so you'll see like, and I think it's raised as well, kind of like the ones in New Orleans. So you see the structures for all that. So this is the city's cemetery, or the primary one. This little community here, El Limonal, is a community that was kind of transplanted from a bunch of mudslides way back in the 90s. Hurricane Mitch caused a lot of people to lose their homes and everything and need to be transplanted. The government set up this little community here and placed a bunch of people there because I guess the land wasn't used. This is actually one of the initial reasons that Amigos for Christ was founded, and to try to help people move out of there. And so some of their first projects was to build homes in a better, different place and to resettle people there. Kind of sadly, but also a little bit telling of just the human experience, a lot of the people didn't actually want to leave because that's just where they were, and that they, the existence is actually quite sad. If we were to have walked through that area, that community, there's a lot of people that are making a living by scavenging recyclables out of the landfill itself, and the landfill is like they often are burning it, or burning tires, things like that. So the conditions are truly horrific, and it's like a ash, soil, trash mixture, just this whole thing. And so with wastewater as a, and there were people, I think some of the first slides I showed, I didn't have the good quality photo of it. I have to see if I have the original of that. But people using the wastewater as a way to sift through. That's a wastewater effluent, so it has some treatment, but it's like kind of bright green from all the algae. So to sift through, sort through, find metal, find scraps, recyclables. So that was one of the profound things for me, I guess probably 12 years ago, one of the times I visited, just seeing a mother with her child sitting in the ash, and just, there was a moment I had that was exceptionally profound. It was like, why is that not me sitting there as that child? Why is that not my existence? And it just strikes you like, wow, why not? That could be, right? That there's no rhyme or reason that's not the particular place I found myself, right? So it's striking. And this was this little spot, I'm highlighting it with a personal experience here, but yeah, and then they have a lot of issues with people actually just finding glue and other stuff like that, snorting it as a way to just escape their reality, and that really just tears up their brain, and then they're kind of like zombies. And you see young men and people just in a really bad spot. So that it was really surprising and heart-wrenching for the Amigos crew to realize, even when they did move people out, it's still something of an opportunity, so other people might move into these homes that you just couldn't fathom somebody wanting to be there or deciding to be there on purpose. But it's hard to understand sometimes, but that's, people, I guess, see things differently, certainly don't have quite the education, don't realize the hazards and all that. So that didn't, I wasn't planning for wastewater stabilization lagoons to get so emotional or deep, but here we are. Okay, so there's an example. If we were to zoom out, over to the right here would be the compound. Maybe I'll just pull up Google Earth and we can explore that together real quick. See how well we do. So here's Chinandega, the large volcano San Cristobal there. That's what we did not climb that one. That one's quite the climb. But we saw that a lot in our adventures. Okay, so downtown Chinandega, and again, to get there, we were traveling from Managua, southeast of here. So we would have driven in kind of on a main road. And here's that big traffic circle that we went around several times. So that would probably be familiar. Most of what, so, and then the Amigos compound, if we would take a right there and then a left onto this, I think it's this street, and then right up into here to the Amigos compound. So you can see the rancho, the spot where we had some pictures from the rooftop. That was right here. This is where the cars and the buses would park, all that. So that's where we stayed. And so if we just look a bit west, we can see the river running through here. And so to get to El Limonal and the wastewater plant, would be right over here. So that's the setup. And that's basically taking, as far as I understand, all of the wastewater for Chinandega. I don't know if maybe they have another system somewhere, but I believe that's their wastewater treatment. So, you know, a lot of places don't have a centralized system. Chinandega does, and that's the treatment it's receiving. And you know, even just looking at it right here and now, you kind of notice there's not a whole lot of infrastructure there, aside from the couple ponds. So the level of treatment is perhaps questionable there. Is for sure questionable, we'll say. Okay, so if this is just kind of some pond, why does it work? How does it work? Does it work? Well, as I mentioned, it's sort of a biomimicry type of strategy or plan. Essentially, we're going to provide the right conditions for several processes to happen, and we're going to do so intentionally so that we're getting, we'll have solids build up, and eventually that might need to be dug out and landfilled. But overall, there should be some digestion of that like a septic tank to make sure that that's not happening too quickly. Some beneficial processes throughout. So we'll have wind and sunlight providing oxygen. So essentially, the wind is providing aeration. That's just simply improving the natural re-aeration that it's going to occur based on the gradient difference between the concentration in the atmosphere and the solubility of oxygen and the saturation condition. That differential is going to drive oxygen into the water, assuming we have oxygen consumption in the water, which we certainly will. So if you've taken my water wastewater class, we probably talked about BOD and that re-aeration, all that. So there's equations we could use to model that process, how quickly that's going in, all of that. We're also going to have CO2 exchanging. Sometimes this might be CO2 heading out based on that respiration, production of CO2, but it also could be coming in, same process. The sunlight's going to provide algae the opportunity to take the CO2 in the water and convert it to oxygen and to algae cells, right? So they're going to take in CO2, do the photosynthesis, get oxygen and release oxygen, forming bacterial cells, having the energy because of that reaction. Of course, these will also die, so that carbon is going to be cycled within the system, and you're going to continuously have some recirculation of the carbon cycle here. It's not a complete BOD removal, but we should have a net discharge of some CO2, especially during the night, and some sequestration of carbon in general, probably organic carbon. That's going to be a lot of what you dig out whenever you do have to get rid of the sludge. Okay, so there's going to be some combination there, some balance, but that's all kind of part of the scheme. So if things are going well, you'll have the algae they're producing oxygen during the day. They are consuming it during the night, just like all the other bacteria. And so you'll have these processes at some level. So you see the aerobic zone kind of goes to about here on this graphic. That'll mostly be the respiration and photosynthesis as usual. Below that, we're going to have the anaerobic processes. That's a bit different. Talked about that, learned more about that in wastewater. And so then you'll have this facultative zone where there's a bit of both, and then you're going to have the completely anaerobic zone. That's kind of the scheme here. Okay, and then of course your sludge, and there's going to be anaerobic processes in there, and so you'll have down in the anaerobic, you're going to have several more volatile species like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide coming up, methane. So all sorts of processes happening together, and all told, we get some good decomposition of waste products into more simpler compounds, into algae and bacterial cells, and that all works for us kind of the way we want. Okay, another visualization here if we're just tracking kind of the organic molecules. We can take a look at, okay, so we've got soluble organics coming up from that anaerobic zone, mixing with the wastewater, and there's, soluble stuff in the wastewater itself, really converting a lot of that into the algae and into bacteria, sending that back down when they die and decay in sediment, and so on, right? So we can see, kind of a big picture here. We've got nitrogen, hydrogen, methane that we expect to leave, and we have, just basically the same things that we've been saying. Just another visualization of it. Okay, so one of the things to think about is kind of the symbiosis here that is really key to the design, and that is the bacteria plus the algae, right? We kind of need both. There are some designs, I'll talk about an alternate towards the end. I don't have as much information about that, but your typical lagoon system wants both algae and bacteria because there's this synergy. If you think about, that's why I have the shark picture here. It's the shark with these little remoras. It's not going to eat the remoras because they're actually doing the shark a favor and keeping the shark clean. But they also get to hitch a ride and get to scavenge all the little bits of stuff that fall out of the shark's teeth, right? So there's that symbiotic process here. Got the oxygen supply. You're also getting decomposition from the anaerobic bacteria releasing these nutrients, phosphate, ammonia, even the CO2 that's produced, that's nutrients for the algae. So all of these things put together, we get a good situation, and we could even describe the amount of energy that is produced as we take a reaction here, taking CO2, water, and ammonia, plus light for the photosynthesis, to create essentially probably sugars, types of stuff, carbon molecules, building blocks for the cells, and sugars, plus oxygen and water, and we could find that, okay, we're getting a net energy benefit from that, right? So the algae are doing that for that purpose. We also notice that in this scenario, we're producing H+, so there is some consideration of, do we have a net formation of acid in our system? And I think all told it wouldn't be, but that might be the case for some areas in our pond. Okay, so I want to take a minute to highlight what the day and night cycle, diurnal cycles, what that looks like in terms of what's happening here. So we have this, and I think this is from our book or some other resource I found. And I'll read this briefly, and then we'll kind of take a closer look at each of these figures here, because what we're going to look at is during the day, at the middle of the night, there's no sunlight, and then the sun comes up, and then the sun goes down, and we cycle that, right? And so it kind of is interesting to take a look at what chemicals, what molecules, what nutrients, what's happening with them during this period. So for a daily CO2 profile, we could say that the photosynthetic activity in one of these ponds, that's demanding a lot of CO2 for the algae. And so I'm going to take a look at that. The first would be CO2 as an end product of the bacterial oxidation and fermentation of organics. The second is going to be CO2 from the atmosphere, so how much CO2 is coming into the pond from the atmosphere. And the third is going to be CO2 from inorganic species that, just simply CO2, bicarbonate, carbonate, just what's happening with those. And overall, these panels is going to show that kind of vigorous photosynthetic activity could lead to rapid depletion of CO2. And that could become an issue. That also causes a rise in the pH. And that's been studied and got some references there. So part A, here's the CO2 as the microbial end product. So during the day, we get some amount of CO2. We also see a little bit of fluctuation in the pH accordingly. But the CO2 produced by bacteria throughout a 24-hour day, and I believe this should be midnight, it'll increase a bit as we get closer to daylight, and then it's going to start decreasing and then kind of come back up. So that's a bit of a cycle, and we can see the pH is kind of doing the reverse there, following it. CO2 coming in from the atmosphere, we can see that early we've got some amount coming in. It kind of peaks right around sunrise. It's going to dip, and I could have this wrong. Maybe this is daylight starting, daybreak at the start here. Might make a little more sense, but we can see that profile changing based on what kind of the pond needs, based on how much CO2 happens to be there will affect how much is coming in from the atmosphere, right? That pressure gradient there. And then finally, what form do we have with the inorganic species that's freely floating in there? And we have very little during, I think this must be the sunlight time frame, because that's when the algae are pulling it all out, right? So that's kind of a demonstration of what's happening there. Okay, we also see that this scale gets quite low, 10 to the minus 5 compared to 10 to the minus 2 for these other species. Okay, so that's kind of just a picture of like the scale, how things are going with the carbon, how important it is that the algae has it so that they can produce oxygen, and that really showing that tie-in there. Algae are really doing a lot, and they could actually probably do a lot more if we gave them just a lot more CO2. So, and of course, this is all going to be cyclical and interrelated with the bacteria. So, how do we know then how much sunlight are we going to get? Well, we can take a look and by latitude, kind of get some estimation of how much solar energy do we have, so this is a table of the probable values of visible solar energy as a function of latitude and month. So I think it's the number of days in which you'd have enough solar energy to supply the pond with what it needs to do. And so at the equator, we can see the monthly variation is not so high. It's, as you might expect, it's kind of high all year round. Now, if you do stop and think about it a moment, the sun is closest to the equator during the equinoxes, kind of the spring and the fall, where it's, we experience in the northern hemisphere that the days are getting longer because given our rotation and all that, it's as if the sun is coming up to the northern hemisphere now, and it's actually away from the equator, right? So more directly over us, and then it's going to do the opposite, right? So in the spring and the summer, the summer and the winter here is going to be the low points at the equator. So you can kind of see that from this data. At any rate, you go up to something like, we are what, 30 something latitude, I think. We have through the year pretty good number of days per month, and the lowest being December, and that's still about 120 days. What is this? This couldn't be days per month. I'm totally wrong on that. Maybe it's just some solar irradiance value. Okay, and then if we look at 60 latitude, we across the board don't have much, right? That's just not getting a whole lot of sunlight. Okay, so that would be something we could use to design if we have some specific amount, and we could look at, this other table. I didn't even bother including all of the data here, but we can kind of look at what types of units we'd be looking at, how they would fit into our algae growth system to consider this. So this would be some light energy flux, and this might be calories per day per liter. That's kind of what they're describing that. So that might be what this table is describing, or something like that. We might have some detention period that we're tracking. Okay, how much time does the water spend in our pond? Some accounting for the fact that it's not getting it all day long, so the diurnal illumination. We could match that with how much BOD the system is receiving, and what's the temperature. So all of these factors would go into telling us how to design a pond that could accommodate this much biological oxygen demand, this much wastewater, given how quickly these processes will happen. So lots of moving pieces there, but you can imagine this would all go into some design criteria, and all go into, or some design equations to meet a particular criteria, right? So it feels very simply like, oh, we're just throwing all this wastewater in a pond and letting that be, but there is actually quite a bit of design that we can go into this. Sludge accumulation in the pond would also affect that, because that's going to change the depth. So you would design, just like our septic tanks, design for some number of years before you have to pump it out or dig it out, so that your process can still occur properly given your designed treatment flow. Okay, we could get into gas transfer reactions. This is another one of the reasons why temperature is important. Clearly, it's important for the biological activity, but also the solubility of our gases, right? So we could go into, okay, what's the water temperature for that? What are the mixing conditions? What's the typical wind in this area? The last couple of weeks, it felt pretty much fairly windy around here, not in a bad way, just kind of breezy, right? It's had decent winds. If you look at a pond at any point, there's a good chance you're seeing the mixing in action at the surface of that pond, right? Kind of pushing the water around, getting some ripples. Maybe you have a pond and you enclosed it in, like, just in the middle of a forest. Well, that might actually block a fair amount of wind. Or maybe you just have a region that's not very windy. That would be important. So we could take some calculations here to estimate how much or how quickly your oxygen and CO2 are going to be transferred into the water. We've got equations for that. We could take a look at that. We're not going to go all the way there here, but overall, once you start looking at this and how to account for it, you can develop an empirical equation that says, all right, well, given the wind and the velocity, the depth of the pond, how much circulation are we expecting because of the wind? Because that could cause some circulation of the water. How much mixing are we getting from that? And how much at the surface, how much air are we getting pushed in? So I'm highlighting a few things here so you have it in the slides in case that was a particular interest for you. There are ways to do that. And this will relate very, very well with, how much power are we putting in to do the mixing, except for it's wind power, right? Or perhaps maybe how much power in the fountain are we putting, right, to cause that action. Okay, Couple other notes: if we're doing anaerobic processes, we're going to end up getting a lot of sulfur. So typically there's a bit of sulfur atoms in biological matter. It's not a huge amount, but as soon as you have decaying organics, you're going to end up forming some sulfur compounds. So hydrogen sulfide, H2S, is quite stinky. We experience it that way, which is probably kind of a evolutionary safety mechanism, we'll say, because it is quite toxic to humans at very low levels. So we can actually sense it with our noses way before it's at toxic levels, which is great, right? So we don't accidentally consume it. It's also a pretty good indicator that there's some decaying, maybe fermenting, rotting organic matter. So it's probably very helpful that, back before we had the germ theory of disease and everything, and refrigerators, freezers, all of that, right? Before all that, if you wanted to eat something and you weren't so sure about it, well, something's going to tell you that this is not good. If it's rotting, that's probably going to be hydrogen sulfide, right? It's going to let you know, hey, maybe this isn't the right thing to eat. Maybe this is just going to gross me out just by smelling it, right? And you act accordingly. And here we all are, right? It worked. So that's clearly can be a problem then if we have an anaerobic process that's producing a lot of that. Are we then discharging that out and making a big stink? Thankfully, in our facultative type systems, we can also get oxidation to sulfate, right? So if we take H2S to S and then to sulfate, that's going to require a lot of oxygen, but that will stabilize it to sulfate instead of just these hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so we can take a look at that. Part of this is also, if we stop and think about it, the sulfur might be caught up in organic molecules in the first place, and so this anaerobic process may release it from the organics that way. So it's kind of breaking down the organic molecules to the point where it's being released as sulfide, and then the aerobic process is converting that to sulfate, and that's discharged as pretty low hazard ion. Okay, so if sulfide concentrations reach about 6 milligrams per liter, that's bad news because that's going to kill off our algae. So that's another component here. We really need those algae there to produce our oxygen, and we really need that oxygen to produce our sulfate from the sulfide. And so if the sulfide happens to get too high concentration, it's going to kill off all the algae, and then you're going to have no oxygen anymore, and then you're going to have a lot more sulfide. So even less algae, right? Less than zero somehow. So that's a potential major issue. But typically, you'll have a variation between 0 during the day when you of hydrogen sulfide during the day when you've got the sunlight, and then you'll have some buildup at night, 1 to 2 milligrams per liter. Here's another reason why seasonal variation could matter a lot, and why cold climates, further from the equator, have more potential issues here. So cold or high latitude risks. Because if you have days and days of no sunlight, what's that going to do to your sulfide concentration, right? That could be quite bad for your system. Okay, just have a bit of a summary slide here. This is from our book that kind of puts all this together in one nice little pond. We can see the aerobic zone, the anoxic zone, or also known as facultative, and then so they're making a distinction between anoxic, where there's a little bit of oxygen, but it's not fully oxygenated, and anaerobic, meaning kind of none. And you could take a look at the biochemistry. We've been talking about these things, the aerobic treatment units, septic units, and so this is just kind of the concept. A facultative lagoon has all three. and we have the nutrients cycling accordingly. Okay, so what can we expect in terms of ecology, bacteria, algae, that kind of stuff? Well, essentially, we might get some plants in the system growing. Hopefully not too much of things like duckweed. We'll come back and talk about that, but we don't want plants that are going to cover the surface and prevent light from getting to the algae in these systems. But there could be some, and mostly we'd have green bacteria and purple bacteria. The green bacteria, I think that's classifying cyanobacteria, which is what I've been talking about with algae. There are also algae that are not bacteria, so actual algae cells, but cyanobacteria kind of act like them. So some distinction there that might actually be kind of the distinction between these two. Anyway, we've got hydrogen sulfide, and so this source of reducing power, so we can end up with hydrogen sulfide, I think is what it's saying. So which ones can do photosynthetic, or could be sources of photosynthetic oxygen? Plants, yes. Okay, I guess I'm wrong about the green bacteria being cyanobacteria, so forget that. This must just be algae and cyanobacteria. Source of carbon for these guys. Oh, that's what it is, the source of stuff. Okay, CO2 would be the source of carbon for the plants, and for the green bacteria. Purple bacteria, I actually, I should have gone back and looked at this closer. I apologize for that. This might all be photosynthetic bacteria. So that makes a little more sense. So we have two different types of cyanobacteria, purple and green. So okay. So I think these guys will use oxygen that's just naturally in the system. Even if they're doing photosynthesis, maybe they don't keep it. Maybe that's what it's saying. Okay. But any of these can use CO2 as a carbon source. The purple bacteria can also use organic matter for that. In terms of relating to the oxygen, these would be aerobic, these guys would be anaerobic, and this guy could be either. So, sorry, I was not quite prepared to talk about that as much as I ought to have been, but the point really is there's variations in the ecology here, what kind of organisms are living where, and kind of their function, what they can use, microbiology kind of stuff. You've seen this type of stuff before, and you could recognize that, hey, we might want to pay attention to what's growing in which area. Is that fine? Is that what we wanted? Are we good here? And that there's kind of a natural design or implementation there. Okay, so speaking of design, what would it maybe look like to do some sort of calculation? And this is, again, from our book. If we were to kind of scheme some system, maybe we'd take a look at the loading rate we expect, some mass of BOD per day given some flow rate. So we could calculate that, okay, we have this amount of BOD coming in, given X number of people living in this area, discharging wastewater, what's the typical parameters here. We can use something like that and then design it according to standard kind of design specs for a lagoon. So we've got table 22.4 from our book. It's giving some typical values here. So we have two different types. We have the anaerobic and the facultative. And so the organic loading we can handle for anaerobic would be 100 to 350 grams of BOD5 per cubic meter per day. So this is the high loading condition. If you recall, these are typical for high loading. And that's why we see those values much larger than the 15 to 80. Well, I don't know why this, okay, scratch that. They're using different units for each, and that confuses me. But the next one, the facultative lagoon, says 15 to 80 kilograms of BOD5 per hectare per day. So that's a little confusing. I don't know why they do that. But point is, we could get some difference here and plan it accordingly. The anaerobic lagoon, we see 2 to 5 meters. That is quite a bit deeper than the kind of 1 to 2.5 meters for the facultative lagoons. The detention time for these at the very minimum would be a few days. I guess 1 day for the anaerobic, but typically 20 to 50, and the facultative 20 to 180. BOD removal percentages, we can see it's a bit temperature dependent. We don't get as much for the anaerobic. And we get some pathogen removal. So both of these are listing Vibrio cholera and helminth eggs. So cholera, probably not going to be super happy with the conditions, and you're not going to have anything generated, letting it grow and multiply. So there's just going to be some general decay over at least several days. So that'll be good, and likewise the eggs. But you're not really getting much else. There's not a whole lot of pathogen removal. So you're expecting lots of pathogens still to be at risk in this type of system. Okay, a few overall things here. So BOD 70 to 95%, TSS 55 to 95. That's basically sedimentation, trying to get rid of things like that. And one of the components of total suspended solids could actually be algae, by the way. So if algae is freely floating in there, that's a suspended solid. So if that's still floating by the time you're discharging, and you're regulating based on this, some of that could just be algae being a bit of a problem. Okay, so maybe we do get a little bit of virus and bacteria removal. Not confident that you'd get 100% by any means, but if it stays there long enough, if you have a really long detention time, maybe that's reasonable. Okay, quick note on, is there a problem with the lagoon? So if we have a bright, rich green color, if we just take a look at the color of the system, so bright, rich green indicates good conditions, plenty of green algae. The green color is suspended throughout the water column. So that would be a good thing. So if it's a dull green or yellowish, maybe we've got some undesirable types of algae, blue-green, filamentous, which is just going to create kind of a mess and probably prevent sedimentation or disrupt things like that. That might be becoming dominant in the lagoon. Blue-green algae are stringy and can clump, block sunlight, cause hydraulic short-circuiting. They may exhibit a green pea soup color. Okay, that's sometimes an issue when the pH is low, or when protozoa, so single-cell organisms that are eukaryotic, which means they have a full cell wall and stuff, they like to go and gobble up algae. So if you get a bunch of them growing, you could actually have them preying on this algae that you were trying to grow and have a problem with that. Okay, gray or black means you kind of went anaerobic. You'd probably smell it too. Yeah, so that would not be so good. If it's tan, brown, or red, maybe you're getting some soil in there, bank erosion, if you didn't line it, or maybe there's a tear, something like that. Possibly some other weird algae with some different pigmentation. But a lot of times you can learn a fair bit from just looking at the color. Okay, a few notes from the book on just sort of how you would care for a lagoon. You want to essentially keep the basic stuff clean, like your influent. You probably have some grit chamber, stuff like that. So you'd have to clean that up a bit. You want to try to keep burrowing animals away so they don't burrow into your liner and disrupt things like that. So you actually probably want to mow and things like that to keep it a little bit less likely for getting all sorts of wildlife investing themselves in the area, we'll say. That would be good. You might have to remove some scum off the top occasionally. Watch for floating plants. Mentioned duckweed could be a big problem. Visual inspection, kind of just maintaining the property, right? That's kind of the deal. Of course, you're trying to also keep people away. You don't want human exposure to your wastewater. Okay, and then typically you'd be also monitoring your sludge depth. Perhaps 2 to 5 years, you'd have to remove sludge. Okay, maybe 5 to 10 years if things are going well. Okay, so I've been talking about duckweed, and I just wanted to share a couple examples. There's I think the scientific name of duckweed contains lemna, so there's these things called lemna lagoons. This is one in Louisiana. I visited a month or two ago, and essentially this is designing a system where instead of using algae, we are intentionally blocking the sunlight. So it's going to be at least a lot of it will be anaerobic because we're blocking that sunlight. There's organics in here. So what's interesting is if we were to look in the distance, it's kind of hard to see, but over in this area, or I guess probably here on this, there's actually some fountains. So there's a corner of the pond where you've got aeration. So that's where the wastewater is coming in, and you've got this aeration zone, and the water will kind of hang out there for a little while. So you'll have some aeration treatment, and then it's going to be just slowly working its way through the rest of the pond. And the residence time for this particular pond was about 90 days. And then the water is collected here, and then there's a bit of it was supposed to be a disinfection unit over there, although the UV system was missing, apparently. So that was a little confusing. We just showed up here, and the gate was open, so we just drove in and took our samples and looked around, and Ronnie was checking to see if the local gator was nearby, and we didn't find it, but got to hear some stories, and then we left before anybody showed up to shoo us off. But you can see, like, that's kind of the thing of it, right? You don't need somebody here 24/7. Don't need a whole lot of security. I don't know if I'm guessing the disinfection unit was not stolen, but maybe they do need security if that was but the interesting thing about this, so with the duckweed, the lemna system here, they're intentionally keeping the duckweed going, and you see this interesting there's plastic barriers that are essentially floating on the surface here. They're basically just cordoning off a couple square meters or so of area, preventing the wind from blowing all of the duckweed to one side or the other, because that would definitely happen. So it takes a little bit more infrastructure. The duckweed itself can be harvested then instead of like the sludge, because it's going to be taking a lot of those nutrients and clumping up. It's actually probably not mandatory. I think you can just let them sit there. Your lagoon itself will accumulate the sludge as they die off and decay and stuff. But I think they stopped doing it, but the people who sell this as a product will, also provide a harvesting system, so you can take all that duckweed and like pile it up and then send it to a landfill or whatever you need to do. But this certainly changes the dynamics of the treatment. That's going to be a way to change it into, I think, one of the anaerobic system generally, although by the time you're towards the end, maybe you just have consumed enough waste and maybe it's not so much. I don't think the duckweed's going to allow much oxygen into the system. Maybe in a couple inches, which could help with the smells and things like that. I don't know enough about these systems to say too much further. I just know it's one of the options. And if you look online, so this is what duckweed looks like, by the way, if you were to take a close look. And apparently ducks love it. So that's a thing. But it's really small little leaves that'll just be kind of floating there. and it's tiny little roots that are hanging down, and just bunches of little tiny duckweed plants there. So a couple of the positives you can get from this is you're not having algae as a source of total suspended solids in your effluent. So if that was something you're struggling to achieve with your typical lagoon system, maybe that's a little better. With all this duckweed that you're forming, might be a little bit better passive nutrient removal, phosphorus and nitrogen. It's pretty easy to collect the duckweed to dispose of it. Maybe not necessary all the time, but certainly not so difficult of a process. Downsides would be lower dissolved oxygen, pretty obvious. So maybe you need some aeration at the end. Manually dealing with the duckweed is another cost. Some people just don't like the appearance, apparently. That was something that one of the sellers or the product marketing was talking about. Some people just don't like it. And then in general, there's probably less reduction of pathogens because you don't have as much UV light naturally coming in and slowly disinfecting. So the UV light that we would get in a normal pond, it's not going to travel very far, and it's not very that type of UV light. That's UVA, maybe a tiny bit of UVB. That's not direct germicidal like our UV dosing systems. So it takes a lot over a long time, basically. It'd be like trying to kill microorganisms by sunburn, right? You'd have to have quite the sunburn to kill a microbe, right? Or maybe to relate that, at the level you're getting a sunburn, your cells are starting to die and get stressed out and stuff. It takes a lot of that type of exposure. Whereas if you take like the UVC, the stuff that damages DNA directly, really efficiently, it just takes a couple seconds before you're getting that with similar amounts of light. So anyway, that's a deal there. Okay, so I think that's about it. So good luck on your senior design, and hope all that goes well.